Chapter 11, Part 3. We're going to move on to the cells of the nervous system. The first one we'll talk about would be neurons, and these are electrically excitable cells. There are three major parts of the neuron cell body, also known as the soma, and you'll probably hear me call it the soma quite a bit. It functions just like other cells function, in that it performs protein synthesis. There's some housekeeping that goes on. There is something called the Nissl bodies in the neuron that we'll talk about a little bit later. Another part of the neuron is the dendrite or the dendrites, and these are extensions, and these extensions are the receivers of information. So the input portion of the cell. So the dendrites are these extensions that kind of stick off, kind of like tree roots, and they receive information from other neurons. The dendrites are usually short, lots of branching, lots of extensions, and those extensions are referred to as dendritic spines. They help to conduct electrical currents. The dendrites do, as well as the spines, help to conduct electrical currents toward the cell body. The third part of the neuron is called the axon, and basically the axon is one of the many things that make up a nerve. So you have many axons together make up a nerve, and axons are like the long part of the nerve. It's like the tail almost of the nerve. And the axon itself arises from what we call the axon hillock, which is a cone-like shape that we also refer to as the trigger zone. And the axon hillock is where action potentials are actually generated. The axons also contain the axoplasm, which is the cytoplasm, and the axolemma, which is the cell membrane. And the axon ends at the presynaptic terminal, and in that terminal or terminal end, you will hear me refer to it as terminal end, because some of the books kind of have, different terms to refer to these. Within those presynaptic terminals, or the terminal ends, there are synaptic vesicles. We've already talked about synaptic vesicles. We've talked about what's in those vesicles. In some cases, it's going to be acetylcholine. In other cases, it'll be a different type of chemical, but usually it is a neurotransmitter. And sometimes neurotransmitters can act as a neurotransmitter and also a hormone, but we'll talk about that when we get into the last unit of this semester. So those are the three major parts and a couple of little extras. Now, when you look at a picture of a neuron, I would expect you to be able to label the following. So you can see here, this main part here is the cell body. And then within that cell body, we have the nucleus. And then the little dot in the nucleus is the nucleolus. And these spike-like things sticking off, the root-like things sticking off, are the dendrites. And then you have, as the branching happens, those dendritic spindles. The axon hillock is this cone-like area here. And then the axon is this long tail-like portion of the neuron. And that's basically a portion of a nerve fiber. A nerve fiber is many of these bundled together. In some neurons, we have Schwann cells that wrap themselves around the axon many times, like a paper towel roll around the center part, around the cone in a paper towel. And the Schwann cells, when they do that, they are forming the myelin sheath. which covers the axon of some neurons. The myelin sheath is not found in all neurons. Let's see. In between each of these Schwann cells, there's a little gap called the node of Ranvier. And then when we get all the way to the end, you have the presynaptic terminals, or the terminal ends. In addition, I will say this, I don't have it on here to label, but when an axon branches into more than one branch here, it's called a collateral. And we'll touch on that a little bit later. So be able to label all of those things on a neuron. And actually, I would also be able to identify the mitochondria, and yeah, I think that's it. The mitochondria, maybe the Nissl bodies in here. All right. So axonic transport mechanisms. So how do things get transported through the axon? So out of the cell body, there are mechanisms that move all sorts of things: cytoskeletal proteins, mitochondria, synaptic vesicles, and they are carried or transported along the axon toward the axon terminals, or the terminal ends. So out of the cell body is movement away from the cell body. It's called anterograde. Into the cell body, so basically if there's damaged organelles, the plasma membrane was recycled, substances brought into the cell through endocytosis, all of these things can be transported the opposite direction toward the cell body, and that's called retrograde. Interesting little note, rabies and herpes virus can enter the axons in damaged skin and then be transported to the CNS. So that's how that makes it to the CNS. So, so as far as these go, these terms, anterograde and retrograde, I would know them as terms, just which way stuff is going. Now I want to stress that this is materials, not a signal. Signals can only go one way in a neuron. Materials within the cell are going to move around, and that's for survival of the cell more than anything. And those can go both ways, using whatever mechanisms are built in. So different types of neurons, we classify them in function and structure. So again, sensory or afferent neurons, they carry action potentials toward the central nervous system, toward the spinal cord and brain. Motor or efferent neurons carry action potentials away from the CNS. So it's basically, what are we going to do about what we sensed? And then in between those, what links those sensory and motor neurons are interneurons, also known as association neurons. And those are found in the CNS. And they link, one part of, afferent and efferent together, basically. Structural classifications include basically how many branches are going on a neuron. So we have multipolar, bipolar, pseudo-unipolar, and anoxonic. So basically, this is what we think of. This is what I think of when I see a neuron. You see a single cell body and a single axon with many branches, okay? So basically there's many branches, many processes sticking off of the cell body, including the axon. A bipolar neuron has the cell body with only two things sticking off of the body. Now, when we talk about this, remember, we're talking about things sticking off the body, not total things. We're talking about things just sticking off the body. So the only thing sticking off the body here is here and here. So that gives it the name bipolar. So there's only two things, two processes sticking off. pseudo-unipolar neuron, or sometimes it's just called unipolar neuron. We have the cell body and a single axon. Even though there's other branches, basically there's only one thing sticking off the cell body itself. Therefore, it's called pseudo-unipolar, and other books refer to it as unipolar. And then an axonic neuron is basically multiple branches, dendrites, if you will, but no axons. All right, so we're going to stop here and pick up on the helper cells of neurons next.